hot and me are not friends. So I'm really loving this cool change. My best friend's parents live in Mount Barker, so I spend a bit of time in Mount Barker, and it was so nice and foggy and cold in the hills yesterday morning. It was great. So I'm loving this change of weather, but I have to be honest with you, in a different sense, I haven't really had a great week. Full transparency, it's been a really long week. One of those weeks where everything I've done has been things I need to do and nothing that I really wanted to do. Haven't had a lot of time to just exist. I'm sure you all have had those weeks. I'm sure more people than would like to admit are in the same boat as me. And so it's just been one of those long weeks of just, it's been thing after thing. It's been emotional, it's been tired. So I'm sure a lot of you understand whether you've had a great week or you haven't had such a great week. You've experienced before. So this change of cold is like a little blessing from God, I suppose, to pushed me through to the end of the week. So in saying that, every time I sat down to write a message this week, message for church, I sit down and I'd read through the Bible, and one thing, I probably shouldn't admit this, but I'm going to, one thing I really don't understand is the church calendar, because we have Epiphany, which is the season that we're in currently, where we talk about Jesus' birth and his baptism, and it's the time after Christmas, and the lead up to Easter, and so Christmas, where we talk about the birth of Jesus, and then we have Epiphany, which is what we're in at the moment, where we talk about the miracles of Jesus, and specifically his baptism, and then we have Lent, where we talk about Jesus' death, and then we have Easter where Jesus dies, and then we have a whole nother 6 months where we still keep talking about Jesus. So I know that there's seasons, but to me, it's just all Jesus, which is great because that's what we're all here for, right? But it's really confusing. So I sat down to write my message this week, and I was like, I don't even know what Epiphany really is. It's complicated. I'm not going to try and explain it because it's still not something that I fully understand, but we're talking about Jesus' miracles, right? So I sat down so many times this week trying to write my message, and I just couldn't get it. I wasn't uninspired. I had a lot of thoughts. I just couldn't translate my thoughts into something. And so I did what every good Christian does, and I went to a pastor. I messaged my mentor pastor, and I was like, hey mate, it's been a big one. It's been a big month. I haven't done a message for a while. I'm feeling really uninspired. And he went, come and talk to me, but next week, because I'm really busy this week and you're really busy this week, but I'm sure you'll get a message done. And so I was sitting in the library in Mount Barker yesterday, and I still hadn't written a message. And I opened up my laptop, and I was sitting there trying to write something, and I thought, you know what? I have a lot of messages that I've written previously and given at different churches. I worked at Woodville, and when I was at Endeavour, I used to preach at Mawson Lake, so I have a lot of messages I've written and given at other churches that you guys haven't heard. So I thought, why not spread the love a little bit? So I opened up my archive of messages, and one in particular caught my attention, and it's called How God Shows Up, something like that. And it was a message that I wrote in year 12. And I loved year 12. It was a great year, but it was also a rough year, kind of like this week. It's been a really good week. So it's been a really tough week. And I opened up this message, and it was like right at the top of the folder, and really stood out to me. And so I opened it up. I thought, I'll have a look at that one. And it's talking about God showing up. And it amazed me how, as I was reading through it, something that was so relevant to me in year 12 is so relevant to me almost 2.5 years later. Something that I wrote in a difficult period of my time, and I thought, this is really great, and this is really, it's revealing stuff to me now, and I gave it to shared it with a community, and it went really well, and I was like, that's great, I'll pop it in my archive folder in my computer, and I'll forget about it. And I think that that's something that we do so often with faith, is we kind of pop different seasons that we've had with God into our different archive folders. And we're like, yeah, that was great. And, God showed up, and I remember God showing up, but it's not really applicable this time. It's God will show up again, but I'll forget that he showed up last time. And so I'm going to kind of, having read through that and having talked to Finn, and I emailed it to him, and he was like, yeah, that looks really good. I think that really applies for the season I'm in at the moment. So I'm going to share it with you today, the message that I gave 2.5 years ago, because I've got it on my phone. I have to pull my phone out. It really applied to me now. And I was just so blown away that something that applied to me so long ago still applies today. Now, all of us surround ourselves with people, whether we're having a good week or a bad week. I know that I've spent a lot of my week just talking to my family and my friends and spending time with people just because that's how we get through life. It's not good to keep all our thoughts inside our heads. We have to share them with people. So we've all got people around us who are like really consistent, right? People who remain. I can see my family, my sister, and my best friend sitting in the front row. A lot of my friends around, a lot of people that I've known for a really long time. So we're in a church community here, people that we constantly see, whether it's every Sunday or maybe I'm sure there's some of you that see each other a lot more often than every Sunday. So we all have in our life people that remain. Now, God remains in our lives constantly. He's ever present, and we know this. But God's not sitting in any of these chairs. I can't really see God right now. It'd be great if he was sitting right front and center. It'd probably give me a bit more confidence. But God's not someone that we can see physically as a person. Obviously, we see the way God works through people and the way God works in the world, but it's really hard to see just God as a person. Maybe that's something you have experienced, and that's great. I know the shepherds experienced it. That'd be phenomenal. But it's not something that, I'm not expecting to wake up and open my curtains and just see God standing there, right? So how does God show himself when we feel like he's not present? Something I've obviously been tackling for 2.5 years. Something that I'm someone that really easily forgets that God is around because I'm someone that's really reminded by what is around me. And so, I open up my laptop and I can see my long to-do list, and, I go to work and I can see all the stuff I have to do and X, Y, Z, and I don't see God in that because God's not there. Maybe I need to put a little picture of him next to it. That's a good idea. But God shows us his presence in his most tangible form of love, which is remaining. Now, although you all have those physical people around you, those people that stick by your side, the one thing that they all do is remain. The one love that they show, that everyone shows consistently in my life, is remaining, because they're still there after my long week and after years and years of struggling and years of being really positive and doing lots of things and having all these emotions in these different seasons. These people have remained. Now, we've all had, like I said, these moments of feeling lonely or abandoned or let down by God, and we're overcome by, whether it's hardship and grief, or sometimes you're overcome by joy. But what happens if we get caught in these emotions of life? The joy's up the top and the sorrow's down the bottom. We get caught in that whole journey through the valleys. And so we get lost in our routine. You keep walking, keep swimming, and you get lost in the current, I suppose. Now, at these times, it's really hard to feel God in any capacity. And now we read the Bible and we open up our Bibles, like I'm sure a lot of us do. On those hard weeks, we open up our Bibles, and as I was reading through the Bible verses for this week, I was reminded that God shows up, and God's with the brokenhearted and all these things. But it's really hard to translate what's written there into our own lives. So we have reassurance that God's not going anywhere, and we don't have to feel abandoned or forgotten because God remains even when we don't see it. Now, God shows this in the consistency to show up, right? Now, God's not showing up to our dance recital. He's not showing up to cover my shift at work. And maybe he's sending people to do that, but he's not doing it himself. And so it's really hard to say something like God shows up, God's present in his consistency to show up when we don't physically see him showing up. Through consistency, we feel connected to people, right? I've got my family who I've been around every single day for so long. But it's the consistency that reminds me that every morning when I get out of bed, there's going to be a family member in my house, right? And so through consistency, we feel connected to people. I know that every Monday I'm going to rock up to the church and there's going to be Bible study here, with my group of friends who I really love, because it's been consistent. We've done that forever. And so you trust more in the person who shows up than you do in the person that continuously lets you down. And the way that we feel God, the way that we know that God's going to show up, is by incorporating him into our daily routine. Now, when I'm sick, I rely on my parents to show up, and I know that they're going to show up because they always have. So we can rely on people for the physical things, but it's a lot harder with God because Again, we don't see him as a physical being. But that doesn't mean that he isn't physically present. Tricky. God isn't being inconsistent, but we look for him in really dramatic ways, right? Like I'm not a dancer, but if I was a dancer and I expected God to sit in the front row for all my dance concerts, that's a pretty big ask from God, right? That's a really dramatic way. And obviously, I know now that he wouldn't do, that's not a very practical expectation from God. And so when we're in these really low moments in our lives or these really high moments in our lives, we consistently expect God to show up in really big and dramatic ways. And God's not going to do that because he's got much more important things to be doing than dramatizing our lives, right? And so when we ask God to show up in these big dramatic ways and he doesn't, it's really hard to know that he's showing up at all. We can't expect this dramatic renewal of faith every time we're going through something, but God's still there. Now, we will have periods of time where we connect with God really easily, and we will have periods of time where we don't connect with God so easily. And he can't show up the same way in all of our different circumstances. But nonetheless, he shows up. Every day he shows up by showing us his steadfast faithfulness. Now, this concept was a concept I first learnt about in a book that I was reading. It's called Beholding and Becoming, and it's talking about incorporating worship into your everyday life. It's a very great book. I'd recommend. And the first time I read this book, I was in year 11, and I read it regularly still. It's in my kind of book cycle. And they talked about steadfast faithfulness. Now, when I was 14, that was a really hard concept. And through reading this book, I came to understand a little bit more what it meant. So, Lamentations chapter 3 says, "The steadfast love of God never ceases. His mercies never end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." Steadfast faithfulness. The steadfast love, steadfast meaning never changing, continuously there, omnipresent like God. The steadfast love we find when we're caught up in routine or feel distant from God is shown in a lot of ways. So this consistency of God showing up through his steadfast faithfulness and his steadfast love is something that we can see in the world around us. Now, when I was in math class in high school, and they talk about probability, and I don't know why we needed to do probability every single year of high school, but we did, and I did math the whole way through, so I got really sick of probability. But at the beginning of every probability topic, and they hand you your little booklet of work that you're going to do, they introduce like percentages, right? So they talk about 0% and 25% and 50%, 75% and 100%. And they always give absurd examples, right? So they're like 0%, they're like 0% chance that it's going to rain tomorrow and it'll be cats and dogs, right? 50% chance that when you have a child, it'll be a boy or a girl. They give you all these. And every single time, without fail, I don't know if they teach this at uni, teachers out there, please tell me, 100%, it was always, the sun's going to rise tomorrow. And there's always that one kid at the back of the class who would stick his hand up and be like, what if the apocalypse happens? And they're like, that's not going to happen. That's unrealistic, right? So 100%, the sun is going to rise tomorrow. Now, if we apply this to God and God's steadfast love and steadfast faithfulness, we have 100% assurance that the sun's going to rise tomorrow. And as Christians, if we view the world as this beautiful orchestration of God's sovereignty, then we know that the sun rising is because God asks the sun to rise. So when we have 100% certainty that the sun is going to rise, we have 100% certainty that God is already showing up, right? God's already shown up in our lives today because he made the sun rise. God's already shown up in our lives today because he got us out of bed. When we look at the world through a Christian lens, when we're struggling, we can take every single opportunity, every single thing that means we're simply existing and we get to live in such a beautiful world as the fact that God is showing us how much he loves us, and God is showing up. So the measure and the reliability of a day, the fact that we know that the sun's going to rise at 6:30 in the morning and it's going to set at 8:30 at night, shows us that God is loving and God is faithful and that God will always show up. The start of an end the start and the end of a day isn't dependent on us. And I had to remember this a lot this week, that I can just put myself to bed and forget about everything that's going on. But the sun rising and the sun setting isn't dependent on when I go to sleep. It's not dependent on if I've brushed my teeth twice that day. It's not dependent on whether I've ticked all the things off my to-do list. It's not dependent on any of the things that you guys are doing. If it is, keep it up. But we know it's not. The sun will rise and the sun will set because God makes the sun rise and the sun set. It's got nothing to do with how our lives are going or what we've done in our days. And when we see the making of a day, we see God showing up. Now, a day isn't like a random cluster of time. Yes, it's 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, but it's ordained and sacred. Now, when God created the world, he made it in 7 time periods. However you choose to look at it, there were 7 of them. And the last one was him resting. And he said, this is ordained and this is sacred and we're going to rest, right? But on all of these days, all of these 7 periods of whatever, God was really intentional with what he did. Before God created humans, he created day and night. Before he created people to live on this earth, he created an earth that could function without humans. So if you take all of us humans out of this world, it's still functioning because that's the way that God designed it. When God intentionally directs the rhythm of time through his creation, we become part of his plan, his sovereignty, his steadfast faithfulness. So even in the moments when we think that we don't matter, God set the earth in a way where we can always feel his presence. When I go outside, walk out church in 45 minutes, and I look up and I see the sun or I see the clouds, I know that they're there because God's put them there. So we can behold God's steadfast faithfulness, God's consistency in our everyday lives when we witness the nature around us, that while it changes with the seasons, it doesn't really change. We can experience this display of time and space that we're contained within, and we can see his care in the rotation of the earth and the rising and the setting of the sun. God displays the reliability of his presence in the most consistent way possible. He makes this reminder present for us in our everyday lives. The first thing I do every morning is open up my curtain and let the sunlight in. And I'm sure that many of you have a similar routine. And so when God set the sun to rise and to set every night, he made it a reminder for us that he is present every day, from the moment we wake up to the moment that we fall asleep. When we look up to the sky and we see everything, we're welcome to behold God's steadfastness and consider what good he's done and be a part of the creation that he's made us to be. God gives us our time, whether it's a short period of time or a long period of time. God predetermines our time or what we do with it. It's not ordinary or wasted, but it's good simply because God remains in it. So Psalm 113 verse 3 says, "From the rising of the sun to the place where it sets, let the name of the Lord be praised." Although the sun rising and setting is 100% sure, the only outcome that will happen is that God will show up. These Lutheran schools really should adopt 100%. God's going to show up. So in the spirit of Epiphany, Jesus shows up. Jesus also intentionally spent time with God. We know many times we see in the Easter story that he would go away and he would sit with God and he'd pray with God. And he would take time to remind himself of the creation that he's a part of. And so whether you're taking time intentionally to be with God or you're just showing up to church, you're taking part in this amazing orchestration of God's love and God's power. So as you go into your week, I encourage you to remember that we're all going to feel lonely and distant. We're all going to have tough weeks. I hope that next week's going to be better, but if it's not, God will still show up. We all feel far from God or near from God at different points in time, and he makes every day to be a reminder of how much he loves us. We're part of this orchestration of his sovereignty, and our time is good simply because God is a part of it. God shows up. When we feel that God's not present, he shows up in his tangible love, his consistency, and his steadfast faithfulness. In the rising and setting of the sun, in the leaves falling off of the trees, in the cars going by, God's showing up. So I don't know what it looks like to you that God might that God is present every day. To me, it's the sunrise and the sunset. To other people, it might be other things. As you go in your week, I encourage you to think about how you might rely on God's tangible love and what your everyday might look like if you set yourself little reminders that God will show up. I'm going to pray now. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you are a God who shows up, that you are a God who, in this world, whether we've had the best week of our lives or the worst week of our lives, that we know that you will make the sun rise again tomorrow, that you will be there to show up consistently in the good and the bad, in the small ways and the big ways, Lord. As we go into our weeks, we ask that we don't expect you to show up, but simply that we are reminded that you do. We thank you for being here in this space with us tonight, and as we go out into our weeks, remind us of your love and your goodness and the way that we get to be bold in being part of your creation. In your name we pray. Amen. I believe